GHD Back Extension, we had just discussed it actually the other day as a reminder for coaches of the Sorensen, which is a hold that, of course, we have within our assessment process that we want to put clients into. We want to get an idea in terms of their stooping or bending pattern first, but we just hold this machine and this movement to a really high standard for a number of different reasons. The main thing is just postural endurance. So if people are going to be participating in fitness, and that's one primary area where we want to dissect and assess. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of fine points of the movement. Because it's fairly simple in its execution for coaches, then it won't be that challenging really for you to comprehend exactly how to do it and cue it. Where I'm going to spend a little bit of time around, though, is some of the finer points of it that we sometimes go missing, which just makes sense in terms of principles. When something's really simple, there probably is a lot of principles surrounding it that are quite complex, which you can see in the Sorensen, or sorry, in the back extension with the test is a Sorensen that we do. Short note on that, Beering Sorensen is the test where it comes from. It's a physical therapy test where people would just basically hang off the table and try to hold as long as possible. It was actually done to look at paralysis or loss of certain muscle function on the posterior chain for people, and we just call it the Sorensen for short to keep honoring the movement, but we can do it in the test with this fantastic piece of equipment when people do it. If there is a fear for individuals in getting in this position or being out in front, feet locked in and their body out in front, and they haven't done it before, that is an assessment to itself. So when people have a fear of getting out there, remember, under motor control, when people have fear, it's probably an area where they can't create motor control of that movement. That doesn't make it good or bad for them, but if you have people that are really fearful of getting out there, don't make it super psychological to try to figure out why they're scared. Just basically make it that as a recognition is like, oh, maybe they can't turn everything on that's required in order to do the movement, okay? So we do recommend, if you can in your facility too, have a 45-degree back extension machine, where I'm basically, locked in this position, my feet are locked, I'm on a machine, and I'm bending over this way. So I can still get a good range of motion for the movement, but obviously it makes it a little easier for people to get in and out depending upon their function. But if we do have this guy to work with, what you want to have is to ensure that people have feet locked in underneath, basics obviously, feet locked in underneath. And I'd rather see the feet, or where the heel is, to be a little bit lower than where their pelvis sits, okay? So if you see them from the side, I'd rather you see their feet, and heels here, and their pelvis probably sitting just a little bit above that. And that's just for an option for you to make sure that they get up to a really good extended position, so they have to use their low back and bum and hamstrings as much as possible when they get to that position, okay? You've probably seen it before, but I'll go through one or two repetitions here to show you what that looks like. And then we're going to talk a little bit about tempo and some other things after I recover from these two fantastic reps. And my superior fitness ability, as it grows over time, I'd probably be able to talk actually that's not bad, I can talk quite fast after that. When you instruct this for individuals, I'm kind of kidding, but I'm kind of not. When you instruct this for individuals, just remember that you don't want to pop out 8 reps and then think you're going to be able to instruct for a minute after that. But that's something to discuss in the exercise. When people go into a part where you can imagine they're out in this position and their heart goes down below their hips and then their heart comes back up. The speed at which the heart moves in that position can really change up blood pressure. So you don't have to be a scientist or a physiologist to recognize just how challenging that's going to be. So make sure you give that indication that people haven't been in that inverted position and came back up quickly. That could put a big, working on them. And there's multiple different reasons to why that happens, but just recognize that the heart's going down below the hips and then it has to come back up. Physics of it, in terms of key points of how to prescribe this or thinking about it, is understanding that you want that front part of the pelvis to be out in front of the pad. And that allows you to get the most amount of flexion at the hip, right? It's flexing of the hip to get down. So you can have just the biggest range of motion possible, okay? I don't have too much of a problem with flexion of the lumbar curve at the bottom because it's in an unloaded position, arguably. I think that it can add in adding range of motion long term when people get used to that full flexion ability. So what I mean by that is that people will get into this position, their pelvis is here, and they'll get all the way down, but you'll see their lumbar curve break as they get to the bottom, right? And that's just an indication of length and tension relationships between what's going on down here and how well they can hold that pack position as they bend over. But because they get down here and that curve breaks a tiny bit, don't be too concerned. Because the physics of it would show you that if you could think about the point of the lever, the point arm of it, is that they're putting all the pressure that they can on this part of the pad. So when their body extends up out in front, you can see that lever arm becomes super long, right? Just think of the physics behind that. Their head is down here, they're at the bottom of the rep, and then as they extend and come up, their head is way out in front. So what is that doing? That's creating a lot of load across the low back, bum, and hamstrings due to that lever arm getting longer. But the reason why I make that prevalent to the conversation is that you can then think about loading for the person based upon that. So if someone's out in front, right, just picture me out in front here, my hands are by my side, this will be easier as opposed to this, as opposed to this, as opposed to that. Can you see that? Because I'm adding load to the movement as I move my hands away from the center of position. Right? So if you wanted to make it more challenging, obviously you can have a dumbbell underneath the chin. I like small plates, but a dumbbell works really well. You kind of put it in a bow tie position. Plates, just when they get big, they get cumbersome, and they also have to sit so much here that it really takes away from that force vector, that curve, and that point of tension. So I would say start progressing people with hands by side first for all the reps that you want to have them do it, and then progress their hands up their body to their head and even overhead if they want to, because my arms are low, so it's making it more challenging as I move away from that position. I hope that makes sense. You also want to track people's body weight over time too, because if someone can do a 2-minute Sorensen and they're 240, and they lost 25 pounds and you retest and they can only do 90 seconds, it would make sense that if that total mass was lost and their score is lower, you got some things to be considering there, right? So just think about the total load on the front when they do that. Based upon the physics of that too, you want to see that there's a perfect time under tension and tempo for the back extension as well. And that would be in which you're going to pause at the top. So it would make sense that we're not going to pause at the bottom. So remember our tempo, like 2-0-2-0, 2 seconds down, 0 second pause, 2 seconds up, 0 second pause at the top, right? If we went down for 2 seconds and we rested down there, you're just resting on your tendons and joints. There's actually no tension that's inside of it, if that makes sense, right? So you don't want to rest at the bottom of the extension. You want to ask them to come up and hold it at the top for the best form of isometric tension in that position, okay? So a best form of tempo is usually 4-0-2-2, 3-0-2-2, 5-0-2-2, 5-0-2-3, right? You notice that there was always a pause at the top portion of that concentric contraction, right? So 4 seconds down, no pause, 1, 2 up, and hold it for 1, 2, 3, and then repeat. Best time under tension and total repetitions for this are generally longer than they are shorter. There's basically just one main reason for that. A lot of those postural muscles are specifically respond really well to an enduring setting, okay? Especially in this movement. If we were to reverse the action and go to a reverse hyper, which coaches, you'll understand what that movement is, then that should be done for speed because it's a different kind of chain reaction. But when we have to use our erector spinae, longissimus thoracis, all the thoracolumbar fascia, all the ass muscles, hamstrings, even the 2 joint muscles that cross through my knee, even my feet, then that needs to be more than 5 seconds of effort. And that's just empirically based upon what I've seen. We don't see a lot of gains in people's overall postural endurance by doing really heavy maxes for the back extension. It could be unsafe at sometimes too, but just some of the things to think about. You definitely want to do more endurance environments of time under tension based upon the person, okay? And that's why, of course, we test 2 minutes because it should be a characteristic that everyone should have. Before I get to foot position, I do wanted to say that we found it super interesting that a lot of people who come into fitness that have let's just call it an okay general base of fitness, they can do this okay. You know, and then there's a group of people who may have some dysfunction or are not active that have a problem with it. And then we have a lot of people who are presumed to be really fit that really have a problem with this. So that tells you a lot around how much the fitter or more athletic person is compensating for what looks like, you know, what they have in postural endurance, but their function and their activity may not lead to that. So that's something you can see presented when you do back extensions or if you get a low Sorensen. So other areas, I know this is getting lengthy, but hang with me. There's other ways you can assess the Sorensen that I want to give you some clinical pearls on. When you watch someone do the Sorensen or back extension, I want you to look at them from this angle as well. Because I can see any changes in hypertrophy to either side of the spine. I can see if one ass is working harder than the other. I can also see the height of their knees, right? Because I'm looking at the back of their knees. So if people have terminal knee extension on one side relative to the other, that could tell you something about what's happening at the hip. And then bring them back to that single leg hip extension or a side bridge on the ground, and you may be able to pick some things out of that. You also want to look at where their feet are. So I want that person's feet to be what they're considering neutral on the back. But if I look back here, you can imagine, and I see one foot that's turned out like this and one is straight, that's telling me that I'm getting extension through this leg by having an externally rotated femur when I do it. So then you want to say to yourself, okay, well, that's something to consider. Ask the person to go to a neutral foot and then see what they feel, but you're probably going to figure out that they've been doing some kind of extension on that side because possibly a core control issue, a breathing issue, or they can't turn on this bum. So what they're doing is they're doing an external rotation to get extension, if that makes sense, right? So when I put them into that scared position in the top of the back extension, they're going to turn their foot out. And those are, you know, people that generally have really wide turned out feet. That's not a timer to indicate I'm done. Wide turned out feet, and they're really not getting true hip extension through their low back, bum, and hamstrings coordinated together. Okay? So those are some clinical pearls on assessment. Look from the head. Look at the, you know, where the body sits. If you see any right to left imbalance, look at the foot position. That can tell you a lot. Last point on the assessment, when you have your head in a neutral position for the extension and the Sorensen, if you see people doing too much extension during the movement, that's generally them trying to get extension through their traps or their neck, right? Because I want to get extension from my bum and my back and my hamstrings. That's where I want it to come from, right? So if you see people doing an extension and they get into this with their neck, that's probably telling you that you still need to work on cueing a neutral spine, a neutral face, but also making them focus, which is a good cue for me, on using their bum for the entire movement, okay? Especially if they get into this position all the time, okay? So main points, you know, I told you about the foot position, the hip is a little higher than that. Pauses at the top are really key. Ensure you have endurance in most of your repetitions and sets for this because it's an enduring in movement that would be effective for that. Make sure you load with a dumbbell under the chin if you want to add load to it. Do a preliminary assessment as people are doing it for right to left sidedness, so you can check right to left side, and then ensure you have that, you know, good stable hip position, you know, no more extension than what they consider lumbar curve, and then make sure that they hold that pattern the entire time at the top. So that's the back extension. You can see there's a lot more to it, but I'm sure I gave you a couple of things there that you can put into your practice, and then give me some feedback if you feel appropriate, or some stories based upon your progressions with individuals once you were doing that.